An abandoned puppy appears on the doorstep of a house and is adopted by a family. But one day this dog starts to dig a hole in desperation, and when see what is inside the hole, they have no reaction. Have you ever wondered what a dog chooses a specific house to ask for help? Is it instinct, luck, or something else? On that cold night, the Miller didn't expect something would completely change their lives. The wind was blowing hard outside, swaying the tree branches and causing them to shake slightly. The silence in the house was interrupted by a low sound, almost imperceptible at first. An insistent cry. Sarah Miller, who was collecting dishes in the kitchen after dinner, paused for a moment, frowning. She looked at Mark, her husband, was reading on the couch. "Did you hear that?" he asked, drying his hands on the dish towel. Mark looked up, but before he could respond, the crying a little louder this time. It was a desperate, suffering sound. It didn't sound like a baby crying, but it wasn't just the wind howling either. Jake and Emily, the couple's children, also noticed. 7-year-old Emily looked at the door curiously. 12-year-old Jake stood up from the couch with an attentive look. Sarah walked to the door and put her ear to it, holding the handle hesitantly. Was no one knocking? No sign of movement other than the light rain that was beginning to fall. The sound seemed to come from the ground. When he opened the door, what he saw made his heart sink. There, curled up on the entrance rug, was a puppy, shivering from the cold. Its fur, short light brown, was wet and dirty, clinging to its fragile body. The little ears and bright brown eyes showed fear and exhaustion. He didn't try to away, he didn't growl, he didn't even move. He just looked at them with an expression that mixed tiredness and a silent request for a moment no one moved. Mark's gaze went from the dog to Dark Street. There was no sign of other people, no stopped cars, nothing to indicate where he might have come from. Was as if the cub had appeared out of nowhere. "Poor thing," muttered Emily, slowly kneeling down. Before anyone could say anything, the girl reached out her hand and gently touched the puppy. He didn't flinch. He didn't even try to bite. He just closed his eyes for a second, as if was finally feeling safe. Sarah didn't think twice before picking him up. Her little body was shaking so much that she felt a tightness in her. "He's freezing," he exclaimed. Jake ran to get a towel, while Mark looked, trying to find any clues as to where he could have come from. But the street remained empty. No noise other than the wind and rain. Barking in the distance, no people calling for a dog. "Did he run away from somewhere?" asked Jake when he returned with the towel. Sarah wrapped and held him against her chest, feeling his little heart beating fast. "Maybe yes, but he doesn't have a collar. It doesn't even look a street dog." The puppy, even though it was shaking, placed its head on her shoulder and let out a weak sigh, as if it was relaxing after being scared for so long. Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with curiosity and concern. "Can we keep it?" Sarah and exchanged glances. It wasn't that simple. A dog required responsibility, and they needed to be sure it didn't belong to anyone before they any decisions. "Let's first warm him up, feed him, and see if anyone in the recognizes him," said Mark, closing the door. Inside the house, they placed the puppy in an improvised bed. Near he curled up on the dry towel and looked around, still suspicious, but without showing any resistance. When Jake brought some food and water, Cub hesitated for a few seconds before eating. He seemed too exhausted to even eat. "How can someone abandon a puppy like that?" Emily murmured, next to him and running her hand through his now drier fur. No one responded, but everyone felt the same question echoing in their minds. Sarah that the next day they would check to see if anyone was looking for a lost dog, but there was something about that puppy that bothered her. Just the fact that he appeared alone, in the middle of the night, with no sign of his owner. It was the way he looked at them, as if he already them, like it was there for a reason. And at that moment, none of them had any idea that that wouldn't be the only surprise that, as Emily insisted on calling him, would bring into their lives. Have you ever in a situation where an animal appeared in your life in an unexpected way, as if it was destined to be there? What would you do if you were a puppy like that on your doorstep, without knowing where it came from, but with that look that asks for help? Tell us in the if you've experienced something similar. And subscribe to the channel to follow what will happen to Max, and leave your like so that people know this story and understand that animals deserve to be cared for and loved. Emily couldn't forget the scene that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Max curled up on the doormat came strongly, as if it were engraved in his mind. He was so small, so fragile, and the look he gave her in moment was something she had never seen before. It wasn't just fear, it wasn't just hunger, it was something deeper. That made her wonder what he had been through before he got there. Max's gaze didn't just beg for food or warmth. He seemed to carry a greater weight, suffering that not even such a young puppy should know. Emily tried to imagine what her life would have been like before that night. Had he been taken his mother too early? Had he at some point felt the warmth of home before being discarded as something worthless? Or had he never, even for a day, been truly loved by anyone? It was difficult to accept that someone could be cruel to that extent, leaving a defenseless puppy thrown in the cold, knowing that it would not be able to survive. Emily felt her chest tighten every time she thought it. He tried to push away the images that his mind created. Max lost in the darkness, stumbling weakness, crying softly without anyone coming to help him. Or worse, being ignored by people who may have seen you but simply looked away, moved on. She wanted to believe that he had escaped somehow, that perhaps he had lost and not been abandoned on purpose. But the way he trembled when someone made a sudden movement, the way he devoured his food if he didn't know when his next meal would be, all of that said otherwise. Max wasn't just a lost puppy. He was a puppy, thrown away, and that hurt. It hurt more than Emily could explain. She found herself watching Max as he slept, curled up on a blanket near the fireplace. Even there in the heat safely, he still had small spasms, as if he was reliving difficult moments in, did he still feel afraid? Could it be that deep down he thought that all of this was temporary, that he'd soon be ripped away again? Emily didn't know what she would do to help him forget everything he had been through, but she was sure of one: she would never let him feel like that again. Max would never go hungry again, never be cold again, never be alone again. He'd not understand it yet, but this time he was home, and no one would ever abandon him again. Have you ever met an animal on the street and wondered its story was? Where did he come from? What did he go through? And most importantly, why was no looking for him? Sarah and Mark Miller, along with their children, Jake and Emily, had no doubt that the little pup who showed up on there that cold night needed help. But what they couldn't understand was how such a small and scared dog could be alone in the world, with no one to call him their own. The morning after the puppy's arrival, the family began the search for possible owner. Sarah posted on social media and in community groups, describing the dog and asking that if anyone him, they could get in touch. She also called area veterinary clinics, asking if there was any record of lost puppy that matched Max's description, the name Emily had already started calling the dog, despite Sarah's not to get attached too quickly. While Sarah searched online, Mark got in the car and drove around the neighborhood and surrounding, asking neighbors, business owners, and even stopping some people on the street. Drove slowly along the back roads, watching the streetlights, looking for any wanted signs, but there was nothing. Not a single sign that puppy to anyone. Back home, Sarah and Mark gathered in the kitchen to discuss what to do next. Emily was sitting on the room floor with Max on her lap, gently stroking his ears as he dozed off. Since arriving, the puppy has not left her. Someone tried to catch him. He would look at Emily first, as if he wanted her approval before anything else. It was a connection that was difficult to, but impossible to ignore. What if he was simply abandoned? Asked Jake, sitting at the table, watching parents. Mark sighed, crossing his arms. I wanted to believe not, but the more I think about it, the more it seems to be the case. He was no collar, no chip, no sign that anyone was looking for him. Sarah nodded. Since they started looking for a possible owner, she was convinced that no one would come forward. But the idea of accepting that made her uncomfortable. If Max really had been abandoned, it meant at some point, someone decided he wasn't important enough to have a home. She looked at the puppy sleeping on Emily's lap. He seemed so now, safe, but it was impossible to forget the state he arrived in, shivering from the cold, curled up, looking at them as if he was without words, not to be ignored. What do we do now? Jake asked. There was silence in the kitchen. Mark looked at, waiting for her to take the lead. Emily, on the other side of the room, heard the question and hugged Max a little tighter, as if she afraid of the answer. Sarah took a deep breath and finally said what she already knew she needed to say. We stay with him. Emily looked up, surprised and at the same time radiant. Serious? Serious, you can't keep waiting for someone who will never show up. If no one to take care of him before we do. Emily jumped with joy, hugging Max, who woke up scared and upon noticing her excitement, started wagging tail. Jake smiled, relieved. Mark let out a long sigh as if accepting that from that moment on, the family had just gained a new... So I guess now we need to buy him some things, Mark said, taking out the car keys. Emily's eyes lit up. Can I along? Of course, but no filling the stroller with toys. Emily laughed and placed Max on the couch before running to get a coat. Jake looked his parents and crossed his arms. So that's it? Do we have a dog now? Sarah smiled. It seems so. Jake looked at Max, who was watching with his head cocked to the side, as if he was trying to understand what was going on. He wondered if the cub felt like something had, if he somehow knew that after being alone for so long, he now finally had a home. Have you ever had feeling that a dog knew something you didn't? Like he was trying to say something but couldn't use words? In the first few days at Miller home, Max seemed like any other puppy. He played tirelessly with the new toys Emily bought, ran around the living room his own tail, and loved curling up on the couch next to Jake when the family got together to watch TV. He was loving. And most of all, he showed silent gratitude for finally having a home. But then something started to catch Sarah and Mark's attention. From the first, Max demonstrated peculiar behavior. At first, no one paid much attention. He tugged on the leash energetically, like any puppy excited, explore the world. But they soon realized that he always did it in the same direction, regardless of which path they chose. Could go right, left, or even walk around the neighborhood. But Max always found a way to guide the family in the direction of a small forest that was few streets away from the house. He pulled insistently whenever they tried to follow another path, as if he needed to take them there. At first, Mark thought he just liked the smell of the woods. Dogs have instincts and can feel attracted to certain places for no apparent reason. But as the days went by, Max's behavior became even more evident. Only did he pull in that direction, but he showed clear signs of restlessness when they couldn't go there. Whenever they passed in front of the woods continued walking, Max struggled, barked softly, and looked back several times, as if he didn't want to move. If they weren't out for a walk, he would sit near the door of the house staring at the street, watching for any to leave. Sarah began to wonder if there was any logical explanation for this. Could it be that, before showing up at their house, had lived there? Maybe he had been left in those woods and somehow wanted to return. But if that was the case, why did he seem so eager to show them? One day, upon noticing the puppy's frustration, Emily decided she wanted to see what was catching his attention much. He asked Mark to go in the direction Max wanted on the next walk. Mark hesitated a moment, but eventually relented. After all, maybe if they took Max to the place, he would lose interest and finally stop acting. That afternoon, Sarah, Mark, Emily, and Jake went for a walk with Max, and this time they let him the way. As soon as they left the neighborhood limits and entered the trail that led to the woods, Max became visibly more. He was wagging his tail, but at the same time, his posture indicated that this was more than just excitement about a new. He moved forward determinedly, without stopping to smell trees or explore as normally would. It was as if he knew exactly where he wanted to go. Emily held tight to the collar to keep up with the dog's pace. He led them along a narrow path, dodging fallen branches and dry leaves on the ground. Sarah looked around, trying to the area. Even though they had lived there for years, they had never gone very deep into those woods. The vegetation was dense and the inside seemed different, deeper. Max stopped suddenly. His body tensed and his ears pricked up. He sniffed the air, a few steps forward, and then began to frantically dig at a specific spot in the ground. The family looked at each other. What was he trying to dig? Emily looked at her parents, waiting for some explanation, but no one knew what to say. "What's in there?" Jake asked. Down beside the dog, Sarah hesitated. A strange feeling came over her. Max's behavior seemed like more than just that of a curious puppy. He was there a reason, and something told them that what he would find would change everything. Have you ever noticed how some dogs seem fixated on places? Like there was something there that only they could feel. With Max, this became evident in first few days. Regardless of which way the Miller family chose to go for walks, he always pulled the leash in the same. At first, it seemed like simple curiosity, a natural instinct for a puppy exploring its new environment. But as days passed, it became clear that this was not random. Max not only preferred that path, he needed go there. Sarah noticed it first. Every time went out for a quick walk with him, Max would pull to the left, trying to get her toward the small trail that led into the woods. If she to go another way, he struggled, resisted, looked back, and sometimes even sat down on the ground, refusing to walk in any other direction. And Emily noticed it too. Jake even tested a few different routes, trying to confuse him. First, he took Max to the opposite side of the woods, but a few meters, the puppy started to pull him back. Then he tried to walk around the block to see if he would give up, but halfway through, Max, barking and pulling harder, clearly frustrated. "He doesn't just want to go for a walk, he wants to show us something," said Jake one night, returning from one of the walks. "But what?" Sarah asked, intrigued. Nobody knew the answer, but the dog's insistence was making everyone uneasy. It just a passing fad, like when a dog finds an interesting smell on a lamppost and wants to stay there for minutes. It was a persistent, determined Mark, who at first thought it was all just a coincidence, started paying more attention. Not only did Max insist on going to the woods, but attitude changed as they approached. His body became more tense, his breathing quickened, and his tail, which normally wagged happily, became. There was no fear in his eyes, but an urgency that was difficult to explain. He wanted somehow to take his family there. What if he was there? Sarah suggested, trying to find some logic in it. Or maybe there's something there that he recognizes, Mark added. That Max could have some kind of connection with that forest began to bother everyone. Emily began to observe the dog even more. During the day, stayed near the door, alert for any movement. At night, sometimes I would wake up and go to the window, staring into the woods. He never cried. Never, but stayed there, attentive, as if waiting for something. This is getting weird, Jake commented one night. When he saw Max looking outside, what does he want to show us so badly? Asked Emily, sitting down next to him. The next morning, they decided to Max without stopping him. They would let him take them where he wanted without pulling back on the leash. The puppy, realizing he was in control, practically trotted ahead of the family, leading the way with an excitement mixed with that strange seriousness they had before. As they approached the woods, Max stopped for a moment, the air, and then walked determinedly along a narrow path through the trees. The family exchanged glances but continued following. Max walked as if already knew exactly where he wanted to go. It was then that he suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, his ears perked up, and he began to sniff the ground with intensity. The Miller family stood and watched as the dog began to dig with its small paws, dirt aside. What is he doing? Asked Emily, curious. Sarah felt a shiver. Something was buried there, something Max wanted them to see. Have you ever, like a dog was trying to show you something, but you just couldn't understand it? Like he knew something you didn't. Like he was trying to communicate but didn't have the right words to do it. That's exactly how the Miller family felt. Max insisted every day on taking to the woods. He pulled the leash with determination, refused to follow any other path, and when he got close to the trail that cut through forest, his body became tense, attentive, as if he were waiting for something. The family's curiosity increased, and the question that no one could answer grew stronger every day. What did Max want to show so much? That they decided they needed to find out. Mark and Sarah had already tried to ignore the dog's behavior, but his insistence was becoming more and intense. When Emily asked them to follow Max without interrupting him, Sarah and Mark realized it might be the only way to understand what was happening. As soon as the leash was loosened, Max walked down the trail with energy, as if he knew that this time they would finally understand what he was trying to say. The family followed his steps, avoiding fallen branches and dry leaves along the way. The woods were just a few streets away from their house, but it like a completely different place, isolated from the rest of the neighborhood. The air inside was more humid, the smell of earth and wood took, and the sounds of the city were muffled by the rustling of the trees. Max didn't stop to explore. He didn't sniff corner like he used to in new places. He had a clear objective. After a few minutes of walking, he suddenly stopped. His body, his ears pricked up, and he began sniffing the ground quickly, walking in circles around a large fallen tree. He lifted his snout, looked at Emily, and then began digging with his little paws, throwing dirt and dry leaves aside. The family watched without understanding. "What he doing?" asked Emily, looking at her parents. "I don't know," Sarah replied, taking a step closer. Jake knelt down next to the cub and began to away the dirt with his hands. Max continued digging in a hurry, as if he was trying to reach something. He was there. The puppy didn't stop for even a second, breathing rapidly, determined to get something out of place. "Is there something there?" Mark questioned, already starting to feel uneasy about that scene. Emily knelt beside her brother and began to dig as well. The earth wasn't very hard, and it didn't take long for something small and metallic to start in the dirt. It was a rectangular object, covered in clay and partially rusted. "There," Jake said, carefully pulling the object out. He wiped the dirt off with his hands and was silent for a moment before turning to his parents. "An identification necklace." Emily stared at the necklace in her brother's hand. It was a small piece of metal attached to a ring with a name on it. The engraving was worn but still legible. Buddy. The name stayed in the air for a few seconds. Sarah and Mark looked at each other. Of them knew a dog named Buddy, and they had never heard of one in the neighborhood. "Was that Max's name before we found him?" Emily asked, trying to put the pieces together, but something didn't make sense. Max was a puppy and that necklace looked old, worn with time. If it belonged to him, did it get there? Max was still staring at the ground as if hoping they would understand something he couldn't explain. His gaze was no longer one of it having found something, but of expectation. He knew that necklace was important. He knew they needed to see it. It belonged to another dog, Mark said thoughtfully, one who was here before Max. Sarah took the necklace from Jake's hand and turned it over. For some other information. There was a partially erased number, possibly for a telephone, but it couldn't be read completely. Emily looked at Max and his head. "Did you know this dog, Max? Is that why you brought us here?" The cub didn't react, just continued looking at as if waiting for them to understand something more. That first revelation brought more questions than answers. Who was what happened to him? And how did Max know that necklace was there? For some reason, the feeling that this was just the beginning began to within all of them. Have you ever had the feeling that a dog knew more than he seemed? Like was something behind his behavior that just didn't make sense, something you couldn't explain but also couldn't ignore. After finding the buried in the woods, Sarah felt like she needed answers. The name engraved on it, Buddy, meant nothing to the Miller family, but Max knew that place and wanted them to see that object. What did this mean? When they got home, Sarah picked up the necklace and tried to clean worn metal surface some more. There was a number engraved below the name, probably a telephone, but of exposure had erased some of the numbers. Even so, she decided to try to find some information on the internet. He opened his notebook on the table and started researching. First, he tried something simple, lost dog named Buddy, but the result was too vague. He started filtering by the region where they lived. After a few minutes, something caught his attention. On a local forum, an old post popped up the results. The date was 5 years ago. The title said, "Please help us find our Buddy." Sarah felt a shiver run up her spine. She clicked on the post. The text was short but full of despair. "Buddy went missing last night, and we haven't able to find him. He's never run away before. We're desperate. He's more than a dog to our family. If anyone knows anything, get in touch." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. The family who wrote that clearly loved that dog, but at the time of the chances of Buddy being found was still a mystery. Below the text, there was a photo. The dog in the image was a yellow, strong, healthy, with expressive eyes and a gentle look. Sarah enlarged the image, looking for any detail that would the connection between that dog and the necklace Max found. It was then that he noticed the collar around the neck. It was identical to the one in his hand. Sarah's heart quickened. It wasn't a coincidence. Necklace belonged to the dog in the photo. She called out to Mark, who came from the room holding a cup of coffee. When he saw the computer screen, expression changed. "Is this serious? Do you think it's the same Buddy?" "The necklace is identical," said Sarah, showing the object in her hand. "Took us there for a reason. This dog disappeared 5 years and no one has ever found it." Mark passed his hand over his face thoughtfully. "But did Max know that? He's just a puppy. This happened before he was even born." Sarah had no answer. No explanation made sense. How could a puppy wasn't even a year old know exactly where the collar of another dog that disappeared 5 years ago was? While the two tried to this discovery, Max was lying next to the couch watching them. He didn't seem agitated, but his gaze was fixed on them, as if he knew they were trying to understand. Jake and Emily walked into the kitchen, and Sarah decided to show them the post. Emily's eyes widened. "That Buddy, the Buddy with the necklace." "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "But what if he's still out there?" Jake asked, looking at Max. The idea was, if Buddy was never found, what happened to him? Would he still be alive? And if he was, why did Max seem so connected to it? Mark looked Sarah seriously. "Were you able to find any other information?" Sarah went back to her computer and looked for more posts from the same. He found some updates made in the months following his disappearance. They searching for a while, distributing posters, asking around the neighborhood. But after a year, the postings stopped. Maybe they have lost hope. "Think we need to find out who these people are," Mark said. Sarah agreed. They needed to understand what happened to Buddy, but above all, they to understand why did Max seem to know so much about this. Tell me, what do you think about this? What is the relationship between Max, and tell me below in the comments and continue in the video, because the discovery that Jack and Emily are about to make is shocking. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to find something you thought you had lost forever? Something that, no matter how time has passed, still leaves a void that has never been filled. For the Millers, it was still a mystery. For the Andersons, it was a wound that had been open for years. When Sarah found the old post about Buddy's disappearance, she felt like she couldn't just ignore it. Were too many questions, coincidences that couldn't just be chance. Max knew where Buddy's ID necklace was, and that was no small detail. Something the puppy to the dog that had been missing for 5 years, and the only way to understand what was happening was to find the Andersons. Hesitated before calling the number on the post. I didn't know if the phone still belonged to the family, if they still used that contact, or if they wanted to relive that story, but at the same time I knew I needed to try. He took a deep breath, and the phone rang 3 times before a voice answered on the other end. Hello? Hi, my name is Sarah Miller. I found a post yours about a dog named Buddy. There was silence, then the voice returned hesitantly. Yes, I think I found something that belonged to him. The person on the other end of the line took a few seconds to respond, as if they were processing that. Then he asked in a trembling voice, What? Sarah explained that they had found an identification necklace buried in woods, and that the engraved name was Buddy. He said that a puppy took them to place, and that when searching he found their post. Silence returned. Where are you? Asked the voice. Sarah gave the address, and less than an hour later a car parked in front of the Miller's house. A man and a woman got out. The two seemed to be 50 years old, with a tired look and a look that showed a mixture of expectation and pain. They introduced themselves as Tom Linda Anderson. Sarah led them into the living room where Mark, Jake and Emily were waiting. Max, who until then been lying next to the sofa, stood up the moment they entered. His stance changed. He remained motionless for a few seconds, staring at visitors as if he recognized them, as if something about them activated a memory within him. Tom and Linda didn't even notice, because they focused on what Sarah was holding in her hands. When Sarah held out the identification necklace, Linda's eyes filled with tears. She took with shaking hands and stared at the small piece of metal, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. It's his, he whispered, clutching the to his chest. Tom took a deep breath, passing his hand over his face, trying to contain his emotion. How did you find this? Mark, everything. Max's appearance, his insistent behavior during walks, the way he took them to the woods and started digging. He talked about how Max to know exactly where the necklace was, and how it all seemed like a puzzle that they couldn't put together. The Andersons in silence. When Mark finished speaking, Linda looked at Max for the first time. He continued to stand still, looking at them without as if studying them. This puppy, was he the one who found the necklace? Yes, Emily replied, taking a step forward. Linda down a little, and held out her hand to Max. He hesitated for a second, but then slowly approached, sniffing her fingers. He looks so much like, she said, her voice breaking. The Miller family was silent. They had noticed this too. Max was smaller, still a puppy, but was something in his eyes, in his expression, that reminded him of the dog in the photo Sarah had seen in the post. What happened to Buddy? Asked, breaking the silence. Tom looked at Linda before answering. He took a deep breath before starting to count. Buddy was with us since he was puppy. He was never one to run away. He was always very attached to us. But that night, something happened. What it asked Sarah, intrigued. Linda clutched the necklace to her chest, as if she were holding something far more valuable than a simple piece of... Her gaze was fixed on Max. But it as if, at that moment, she was looking at something beyond him, at something only she could see. The little cub, sitting in the middle of the observed the scene in complete silence. His brown eyes reflected the painful expressions around him, as if he understood words said, as if he knew that the story went far beyond a simple necklace buried in the woods. My son, Michael, disappeared the day as Buddy. Time seemed to stop. The room, previously full of voices and murmurs, fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. They looked at each other, trying to process what they had just heard. Nobody expected that. Ever since Max took them to the woods, since they found necklace, they imagined there was something strange about that story. But no one could have predicted that behind Buddy's was also the disappearance of a child. Tom cleared his throat, his voice choked by the weight of... He was 10 years old, he continued, each word coming out with effort. He went out to play in the yard and never back. We looked for him for weeks, months, and Buddy disappeared along with him. Emily covered her mouth, her hands. Jake, who until now had been standing next to the couch, slowly sat down. Sarah pressed her arms against her body. A cold that didn't come from outside but from inside her. It was different hearing about a missing dog. Dogs run away, get lost, are taken, but that changed everything. Michael's disappearance was not a simple case of a boy straying too far from home. He had not been lost in the nor was he found days later. 5 years, 5 years without answers, without clues, without any trace of where he could, and Buddy had disappeared with him. "And you never had any clues?" Sarah asked, her voice coming out than she intended. Tom lowered his head and shook slowly. "Nothing." Linda closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. If she was reliving it all over again. It was as if they both disappeared from the world. The weight of those words fell on everyone in the room. From the world. How was it possible? A 10-year-old boy and his dog just disappear without a trace. The police would have carried out searches. News have spread throughout the city. Neighbors must have helped, but still no response. Sarah felt a shiver run up her spine. His mind went back to scene he experienced weeks ago. That first night Max showed up. The puppy alone at the door, curled up on the carpet, shivering the cold. The look in his eyes that night. It wasn't just a look from someone asking for shelter. It was a look that seemed to be searching something. She looked at Max. He was still there, motionless, his eyes fixed on the Andersons. He didn't wag tail, he didn't bark. He didn't show any behavior like a normal puppy who had just met someone new. He just watched. Sarah had never a puppy act like that. She looked at Mark, who was frowning, clearly processing the information. Emily held her mother's arm, as if needed some kind of reassurance given what they had just heard. Jake ran his hands through his hair, trying to find some logic to it. But Sarah knew there was no logic. There was no coincidence. Max showed up for a reason. He took them to those woods for a reason. He had them find Necklace for a reason. And the only certainty they had now was that I haven't shown everything yet. Have you ever had the feeling a dog knew exactly what he was doing? Like he's trying to guide you towards something he can't explain but knows is. After Tom and Linda's revelation about Michael's disappearance, the living room fell silent. The weight of those words seemed to have paralyzed everyone, but not Max. On the other side of the room, he stood up, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the door. His body went rigid for a moment, and then without any warning he started barking. First almost like a warning, and then louder, more insistent. His barks were different, not of excitement or fear, but of urgency. He didn't just want, he wanted everyone follow him. Emily was the first to react. "What happened, Max?" The pup turned to her for a second and, without, ran to the front door. He stamped his paw on the wood and barked again. Then he looked at everyone in the room, as if hoping they would. "He wants out," Jake said, standing up. Sarah exchanged a look with Mark and then with the Andersons. Nobody needed to say, everyone knew what Max was asking. He wanted to go back to the woods. The group hurried away, following the cub that ran ahead, impressive determination. They didn't need a collar. They didn't need to call him or guide him. He knew exactly where was going. Night was beginning to fall and the air was colder than it had been in the morning. The woods seemed even denser in dim evening light. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, and the rustling of leaves created an even unsettling atmosphere. Max moved quickly along the trail, avoiding fallen branches and rocks. He sniffed ground from time to time but didn't slow down. It was as if he was returning to something he already knew. The group had to speed up there to keep up with him, feeling the tension increase with each meter covered. And then suddenly he stopped, right next to a large rock, covered in moss and dry leaves. The place didn't look any different from any other part of the woods, but Max knew there was there. He looked back, checking to see if everyone was there, and then started digging, this time with more force. The earth to the sides as its small paws worked in a hurry. He didn't even stop to breathe. His entire body was tense, as if something inside him knew was the moment he had been waiting for. Emily was the first to kneel beside him. "What's there, Max?" Jake didn't take to do the same. He used his hands to push away the dirt, helping Max dig faster. With each handful of dirt removed, the anxiety Mark picked up a piece of wood to help, and even Tom hesitantly knelt down beside the boys to dig with his bare hands. Then something first, just a small metal tip, dirty with dirt and aged by time. Sarah held her breath. Mark wiped the surface of the object with his, revealing what appeared to be a piece of chain, but it was no ordinary chain. Linda, who until then had observing everything in silence, made a choking sound and put her hands over her mouth. "My God!" She fell to her knees beside the hole and picked up the object with shaking hands. It was a thin silver chain with a round pendant hanging it. The pendant was dirty, but a light rub of the fingers was enough for the engraving to visible. Michael. The silence was absolute. The world around seemed to have stopped. Wind blew through the trees, swaying the branches, but no one heard it. Nobody could speak. Tom closed his eyes tightly, as if he was trying to something he couldn't hold back for long. Linda clutched the chain between her fingers, and tears ran down her face. Sarah at Max. He was standing still, staring at the chain in Linda's hands. He didn't bark anymore, he didn't move. His work was done. He'd brought them, but that meant there was still more to be discovered. Have you ever felt like a dog knew more than anyone in the room? That he was to show something, point out a truth that no one else could see? Max was no ordinary puppy. From the moment he appeared at the Miller, his presence seemed shrouded in mystery. Every bark, every stare, every tug on the leash led to something. And now, there in the middle of the woods in front of a moss-covered rock, he led them to yet another. The cub kept digging without stopping. Its small paws hurriedly tore up the damp earth, throwing dry leaves aside. His was labored, but he didn't give up. It was as if he knew that there was still something there, something important, something that could not be buried. Tom Anderson watched the dog's every movement with a tense face, his eyes fixed on the hole that was forming in the beside her. Linda held Michael's name chain, her fingers gripping the cold metal tightly. His son had been missing for 5 years, carried that chain every day, and now here she was, dug up by a cub no one knew. Jake and Emily knelt down Max and began digging with their hands, feeling the soft earth loosen easily. Sarah and Mark just watched, a weight on there. What else did that place hide? Then Jake felt something hard beneath his fingers. "There's something else here," he said, looking his father. Mark picked up a piece of wood and pulled it away from the earth a little more, revealing the metal edges of a small object. When surface was exposed, they could see that it was a rusty box, small enough to fit between your hands. Max stopped digging once the box was revealed. He moved away a little and sat down, watching carefully, as if he knew what was inside was important. Took the box carefully. It was dirty, damp with age, and rust covered much of the lid. He tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," said, trying to force it a little more. Mark took a pocket knife from his pocket and carefully fitted the blade to the edge, applying until the old latch gave way. With a slight click, the lid opened. What was inside made time seem to slow down. There was a piece of red folded carefully. It looked like part of a t-shirt or maybe a coat. Next to it there was another chain, similar to the butt with a smaller rounded pendant. Linda put her hands over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears instantly. "I know that." She took piece of fabric with shaking hands and unfolded it. His fingers slid over the worn cloth, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Here at Michael's," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He was wearing a red coat the day he disappeared." Tom was silent, his eyes fixed on the chain that's still inside the box. He took it carefully and turned the pendant between his fingers. That was his bike keychain. Weight of that discovery fell on everyone. Sarah felt her stomach drop. They weren't just dealing with a missing dog. Was something much bigger buried there. Jake looked at Max, who was still sitting, watching with that look that seemed to say, "I've been trying to show this all this time." Mark cleared his throat, trying to organize his thoughts. Means Michael was here. Tom closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to contain his emotion. But then, where is he now? Silence took the forest again. Everyone felt that Max wasn't finished yet, and the only certainty at that moment was that that puppy would still lead to more answers. Have you ever heard of dogs that sense danger before? That they try to warn us in some way, but we can't always understand the message in time. Tom and Anderson believed that Buddy tried to do just that, but at the time no one noticed, and when they understood, it was already too late. The other chain and the red piece of fabric brought to the surface a pain that, no matter how much time had passed, never really subsided. Linda held small keychain in her hand, as if she was touching something sacred. Tom looked at the fabric of the red coat, his eyes fixed, lost, as if were reliving every detail of that night. Sarah, Mark, Jake, and Emily waited in silence. Nobody wanted to interrupt that moment. But the need to what happened became increasingly urgent. Tom took a deep breath before starting to speak. Michael disappeared 5 years ago. He 10 years old at the time. He paused, clenching his jaw. His voice was firm but filled with pain. That day, it was a late afternoon. Like any, Michael went out to play in the yard, as he always did. He liked to explore the area around the house, but never went far. And Buddy always went along. The two were inseparable. Linda closed her eyes for a moment and shook her head. "We heard Buddy. It was no ordinary bark. He was insistent, as if he was trying to get our attention." Sarah felt a shiver. That felt so familiar. Had we thought he was barking at some animal? Maybe a raccoon, a squirrel. But the barking got louder, more desperate. Tom passed his hand over his, trying to control his emotion. "I went out to see what was going on, but when I got outside, Michael was no longer. The tension in the room was palpable. Buddy was standing near the woods, barking into the woods. like was trying to show me something. But when I got close, he ran into the trees. I called, but he didn't come back. The silence was absolute. We, the police, neighbors helped. We searched for weeks, sniffer dogs, volunteers, and we searched that forest dozens of times. But there was no sign of Linda swallowed hard before completing. And Buddy never came back either. The words weighed heavily on everyone's chest. Pain of losing a child was already devastating, but also losing the only being who could know what happened to him made everything even more cruel. Round. So you never had any clues? No evidence? Tom shook his head. The only thing we found was one of Michael's sneakers near a stream, but was no blood, no footprints leading anywhere. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. Emily looked at Max, who was lying next to the hanging on every word. He didn't wag his tail, he didn't move, just listened. Sarah felt her chest tighten. She looked at Tom and asked, even though she knew the answer would make her even more uneasy, if Buddy was trying to make a point that night, do you think he was trying to say? Tom looked at Sarah, and for the first time, his gaze carried other than sadness. I think he was trying to take us to where Michael was, but we didn't understand in time. The truth was harsh. Now 5 years later, a little pup has appeared in the Miller home as if continuing what Buddy started, as if saying, you still have time, follow me. You ever had the feeling that something was beyond logic? Something that, no matter how hard you tried to find a rational explanation, just didn't sense? That's exactly how the Millers and Andersons felt. Max, a puppy who appeared out of nowhere on the Millers' doorstep, to exactly to find Buddy's ID necklace. I knew where to dig to find Michael's chain and, more than that, he seemed determined to guide them to even greater. But how was this possible? Tom ran his hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. His went back to the night Michael disappeared. He remembered Buddy barking nonstop, trying to warn them, trying to get them into the woods. But at time, no one could understand what the dog was trying to say. Now, years later, a pup who had never met Buddy or Michael was doing exactly the thing. Linda looked at Max as if trying to see something beyond a simple dog. From the he entered that house, the puppy demonstrated strange behavior. He didn't find the Andersons strange. It didn't feel uncomfortable, or on the contrary. Since they arrived, Max had been watching them in an almost human way, as if he had been waiting for a moment, as if I already knew them. Sarah noticed it too. Since Max appeared, his behavior has always been unusual. He not show typical reactions of a dog that had just been rescued. He didn't seem lost nor scared. It was as if he already knew exactly where he was, as if you knew that should be there. That doesn't make sense, Mark muttered, breaking the silence. Approached Max and ran her hand over his head, feeling the soft texture of his fur. The puppy looked at her, but didn't wag his tail like he normally. He just kept his gaze fixed on her as if he was waiting for something. How does he know all this? Emily softly. Nobody responded because nobody knew. Jake crossed his arms, uneasy. This dog showed up at our house without explanation. He took to the woods, found the clues. He's not just any dog. Tom took a deep breath. No, he isn't. Everyone looked at Max again. He remained sitting in the middle of the room, paying attention to their every expression. His dark eyes shone under the light of the room, and he observed each person around him sent a shiver down their spines. Buddy wanted to take us to Michael that night, Linda said. Almost in a, he tried, but we couldn't understand. Tom squeezed his son's chain in his hands, and now this puppy is doing the same thing. Sarah, a look with Mark. It's as if, she hesitated, like he was trying to finish what Buddy started. The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone the same thing, but no one wanted to say it out loud, because it wasn't something that made sense. How could a pup who had never met Buddy where his tracks were? How could such a young dog act as if he was continuing the mission of an animal that years ago? And above all, what else was he trying to show? Max up. He walked to the door and looked back. He wasn't finished yet. Have you ever felt like a dog was trying to tell you something, but you just understand it, as if he was guiding you to something much greater than you could imagine? Max did just that. From the moment he showed up the Miller home, he knew what he was doing. He led the family to Buddy's identification necklace, then up to Michael's, but he wasn't finished yet. He still knew something no one else knew. The next morning, Max was restless. He didn't to eat. I didn't want to play. I wanted nothing more than to leave. He walked around the house from one side to the other, went to the door, at his family, as if he was waiting for them to understand what he wanted. When Emily tried to distract him with a toy, he didn't even look. He was on something only he seemed to feel. Mark noticed it first. He wants to take us back. Sarah looked at the dog and felt a shiver. Last night, They returned home after finding Michael's belongings. She had a feeling the story wasn't over yet. Now, seeing Max acting like that, there was no they needed to follow him. This time Tom and Linda went together. The couple barely slept that night, holding their son's chain and of red fabric, wondering what else that puppy could show. They hadn't had answers for 5 years. Now, there was a that they would finally discover something. Max took off ahead as soon as they left the house. He ran with a different urgency, as if time was important. The group had to hurry to keep up with him. He did not take them along the path where they found the first objects. He went deeper into the forest, passing through denser trees where the sunlight could barely penetrate. The ground was covered in damp leaves. The smell of wet earth filled the air. Sarah began to wonder where Max would take them. It didn't take long for them to find something that made their skip a beat. In the middle of the trees, hidden among fallen branches, there was a shelter. It was small, made of old wood and worn blankets. All around, scattered on the floor, were children's toys, dirty with age. A metal car, a teddy bear with one of its eyes missing, an old notebook with torn pages. Time seemed to stop. Linda put her hand over her mouth, her wide. "This can't be real." Tom approached slowly, kneeling next to one of the toys. He picked up the metal cart and ran his finger over the surface. Michael had one of those. His voice cracked. He turned to Linda, who already had streaming down her face. Max approached the shelter. He sniffed the blankets, walked around the toys, and then looked at the family, if to say the answer is here. Sarah took out her cell phone and called the police. They couldn't ignore that. If Michael had really been there, then he would never have completely disappeared. Maybe he would have survived for a while. Maybe it was Vivo. The police arrived quickly. They the place, took photos, collected the objects. One of the officers looked at Tom and Linda and said seriously, "Let's reopen the investigation." Closed his eyes, emotion overflowing. They waited 5 years to hear those words. In the following days, the new clues led investigators to analyze disappearance records from nearby cities. It was then that information emerged. Michael was seen in another years ago. There was hope. Max didn't just help find clues. He brought something that Tom and Linda hadn't had in a long, the chance to reunite with their son. Have you ever felt like a dog came into your life a greater reason than simply being there? Like he had a mission, something he needed to accomplish, he could move on. Sarah and Mark weren't superstitious people, but after everything that had happened, they couldn't the question that was hanging over them. Was Max just a special dog, or was he somehow continuing what Buddy started? Since Max showed up the miller's doorstep, everything has changed. He wasn't just any puppy. He didn't behave like a lost dog trying to adapt to a new from day one. He seemed to know exactly what to do. As if he was there with a clear, he led them to Buddy's necklace, then to Michael's belongings, and finally, to a shelter that no one knew existed. Step of the journey felt planned, as if there was something bigger than them happening there. For Tom and Linda Anderson, Max was more than just a found on the street. He was the key to unlocking a mystery that had been locked away for 5 years. He brought new clues, a new direction to the investigation, and more than anything, gave back something that the family no longer knew if they would ever get back. Hope still hadn't been found, but for the first time in years, the search didn't seem like a dead end. The police were investigating again. People who had heard of the case were now sharing information, and all of this only happened because Max insisted, because he didn't agree to ignore signs. The Millers watched Tom and Linda, seeing how the pain in their eyes had been replaced by something new. They have all the answers yet, but now they did. A real chance to find them. Emily looked at Max differently now. Before, he was just a cute puppy who were home. Now he was a hero. A small hero with short legs and floppy ears, but who had done what no one else could. Sarah, her hand through the dog's soft fur as he rested next to the sofa. "You didn't come here by chance, did you, Max?" He lifted his head for a look at her, and then closed his eyes again as if he knew his mission was accomplished. At that moment, Sarah was sure. Never managed to finish what he started, but Max did it. Some stories change everything. Max appeared as a simple puppy, but he revealed buried connected lives and brought answers that no one else could. And now, after all, the question remains, was this just or was something much bigger going on? If this story has captivated you so far, imagine what's to come. The next is already on the screen, and I assure you that he will mess with you even more. Before continuing, comment Max knew, because now you are of this story too. Oh, and if this video made you feel something strong, leave a like so that more people can live this now. Click and get ready, because what comes next will give you goosebumps.